Good morning to you all. On perhaps the most important day for us Christians, I am honoured to be reading from today's lesson, Mark 14, verses 27 through 42. You will all fall away, Jesus told them, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Peter declared, even if all fall away, I will not. Truly, I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the others said the same. Gethsemane, they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, he said to them. Stay here and keep watch. Going a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that, if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning the 3rd time, he said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Enough! The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. Here ends this morning's reading.
Good morning and happy Easter. You know, we have a lot of visitors here with us this morning. We are thrilled that you are with us. I will tell you, I am not the preacher for our congregation. We have recently hired a new preacher. He's actually going to be preaching for us next Sunday. So if you'd like to meet him and get to know him, we'd love to have you back here with us next week. Just as a note to the congregation, Paul Fisher, our new preacher, will start preaching occasionally for us April, May, June, and July. He has contractual obligations in his current job that go up until first part of August. So he's going to start coming here and preaching for us on an occasional basis while he finishes those responsibilities. And we'll get the opportunity to kind of slowly get to know him and his style before he takes over full time in August. There is a story told about an old man and an old woman who lived in trailer estates. He was a widower, she was a widow, and they had known each other for a number of years. But they came to a point where there was some affection there. So they were at the bingo game, the weekly bingo game one night. He starts talking to her, making conversation, and he just feels this sense of calling and attraction, and he blurts out, will you marry me? And she gives it 5 or 6 seconds of careful consideration and says, yes, I will. Well, he's just thrilled, and they have some more pleasantries during the evening. They both go back to their respective homes, and he wakes up the next morning. He's very troubled. He can't remember what her answer was. He remembers very clearly asking her to marry him, and he doesn't know what to do about it. So he stews on it, and he finally develops the courage to call her up. And somewhat sheepishly he says, you know, I remember this lovely evening we had last night and the time that we spent together, and I remember very, very clearly asking you to marry me, but you know, I'm not as young as I used to be, and I don't remember what you said. And she says, "Oh," I said very enthusiastically, "Yes, yes I will." And then she continues, "And I'm so glad you called me, because I couldn't remember who it was that asked me." Now, when we talk about courage, we're not always talking about that kind of courage. But we are going to talk this morning about the combination of courage and choice. You know, from the very beginning, the first gift that God gave to mankind, after the gift of life, after the gift of companionship, after the gift of some sense of purpose and working in the garden, the gift that He gave was the gift of choice. Now, it looked somewhat covert at the time, because what He did is He placed a tree in the middle of the garden, and He said, "You can't eat of that tree." And in saying, "You can't eat of that tree," He gave them a choice. Choose whether you want to, do what you want to do, or whether you're going to do what I asked you to do. It was a matter of choice. And as soon as He entered choice into the equation, the human experience changed forever. It was our greatest gift, and it was our greatest curse. And the story of the Bible, from chapter 3 of Genesis all the way through, is a series of stories about choice. We have the choice of Abraham when he has Isaac and is asked to sacrifice him. Are you going to do what I asked you to do, which is really difficult? Or are you going to do what you want to do? We move on, and we have I can't even tell what that picture is. What is that picture? We have Joshua. These are actually out of order. I'm going to hit that one. This is the story of Joseph. Joseph and Potiphar's wife, right? Joseph is given the choice. Do you give in to temptation right in front of you, or do you do what I asked you to do? The third one is story of Joshua. Do you pick up the mantle that Moses has carried for all of these years? Do you lead the children of Israel on a very difficult journey into the promised land? Or do you step back and shrink back from that choice? We have the story of Jonah. Do you go to Nineveh, like I've asked you to do, to a group of people that you don't think are going to receive you very well? Or do you stay away? And then we have the story of Esther. Do you walk in before the king and ask for something that's not going to be popular, that's not going to be easy, because I asked you to do it? Or do you step back? Those are only 5. Over and over and over again in the Old Testament and in the New Testament of the Bible, we have these instances where God places before man choice. And the question for every one of those people was, do you make the right choice, the courageous choice, or do you shrink back and make the easy choice? You see, at its very heart, the Bible is nothing more than a story about choices. And it calls to us to consider 2 very different roads. The road of our desire versus the road of what God calls us to do. And so we have to choose one, and we have to choose wisely. And when we think of Easter, we often think about courage, and the courage that it took for Jesus to go to that cross and to suffer the pain and the anguish that Greg walked us through in his thoughts this morning. But I don't know that I often think about the idea of courage when I think about Easter. I mean, Jesus knew when He came to earth that He was going to ultimately die. He knew the night before that this was the time it was going to happen, because He told His disciples, "My time has come." He told them He was going to die and be raised in 3 days. it was like an inevitable march to this moment. And yet, when we read the account of the events that surround this crucifixion, we see that it wasn't so easy. It was ultimately all about choice. And just as God placed before Adam and Eve at creation that dilemma of choice, He placed it before Jesus at the time of His crucifixion to say, are you going to do this, or are you going to shrink back? When we think about the events that surround the crucifixion, it wasn't just Jesus' choice that's highlighted. There are a number of choices that come into play when we read the crucifixion narrative. When I think about that night in the Garden of Gethsemane, it seems to me that that was probably a very dark, moonless kind of a night. Probably a kind of cold breeze that was carrying through it. One of those nights that just seemed to portend bad things were going to happen. And the first of the choices that comes before us is what I call the conniving choice of Judas. Judas had been a follower of Jesus for 3 years. He had been one of his inner circle of 12 people. And we don't really know at what point Judas turned. Was this something he'd been planning from the very beginning? 3 years with Jesus, he was just waiting for his moment to betray him? Was there something that happened along the way where Jesus wasn't the person he thought he was, and he decided he had to do something to stop this? Was it just pure greed? Give me 30 pieces of silver and I'll do whatever you ask? We don't know what it was, but we know that behind the scenes, unknown to anybody else, Judas decided he was going to betray Jesus. The second choice we see is what I call the cowardly choice. This is the choice of Peter. Peter's even more one of the inner circle. He's one of the 3 special disciples that are always near to Jesus. And just 2 or 3 hours earlier, when Jesus had said, you guys are going to betray me, he said, there's no way in the world I'm ever going to betray you. You couldn't make me betray you. And yet 3 hours later, he's standing in a crowd of people and they say, oh, we recognize you. We know you're one of them. And he said, not me. I'm not one of those guys. Don't blame me. Right? Faced with pressure, faced with consequences of being seen as one of Jesus' followers, Peter steps back and takes the cowardly choice. The third choice we see is what I call the curtailed choice. Right? These are the 3 disciples who went to the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus. They had had a long day. They had done everything he had asked. Remember, he had said, you guys go ahead of me and you prepare a room. You make sure that there's food. You make sure we've got everything we need, because this is going to be a very special Passover meal. And so they went on ahead. They made all of the arrangements. And any of you that are prepared for a party, once that party's over, you're done. Right? I just need to sleep. But Jesus says, I need you a little while longer. I need you to go with me, and I need you to stay awake, and I need you to pray with me. And they couldn't do it. Their ability to follow what Jesus wanted went to a certain point, but when it started to impact the comfort of their lives, they weren't able to do it. And they fell asleep and weren't there when he needed them. The fourth choice is one I call the I can't make a choice. Right? This is the choice of Pontius Pilate. Pilate has the opportunity to potentially release Jesus because the charges are somewhat trumped up. And yet, faced with the pressure that he has in front of him, political and otherwise, the opportunity that potentially the Jews are going to be very unhappy, they might revolt, he might look bad back in Rome, he refuses to take a stand. That I'm not going to make any choice whatsoever. And the famous, I'm washing my hands of this deal. No way in the world am I stepping in on this. You guys do what you want to do. And when we look at all four of those choices, the conniving choice, the cowardly choice, the curtailed choice, I don't know if I can make a choice, haven't we all fallen in to at least one of those, and probably all of those, at some point in our lives? That moment of pressure, that moment when you've got to choose a path. And when we say, you know what, not this time. It's a lot easier to kind of step back. Maybe somebody else will step in. Maybe somebody else will do the right thing. The risk to me is too great, and I'm not going to step into it. You know, when you think about it, it's the Garden of Eden all over again. It's that moment when God has provided an opportunity to make a choice, and human weakness and selfishness step in. But there's something different this time, because in the midst of these pictures of all of these weak choices, this time God provides us with a picture of the right choice, which we're going to call the courageous choice. And it's the choice that Jesus makes. And I've already said, well, I don't often think of that as being courageous. But what we know from the scripture that Dominic read was this was not easy for Jesus. Even though he knew it was coming, even though he knew it was his purpose, even though he knew really this was the whole reason he had become a human being, when he got to that moment and was facing the pain, he struggled with it. And he went into the garden and he said, I need you guys with me because I am wavering. And I need you to pray. And I need strength. And he prayed so hard that they said that blood was coming out of the pores of his forehead. There was so much anxiousness, so much pressure, so much fear that was inside of him of what was coming. And we see an interesting prayer. Because in his prayer, he says, please remove this cup from me. But if you don't want to remove it from me, I will do what you will. And it said he went back and he prayed it again. And he went back and he prayed it again. Over and over the same prayer. Please remove this cup from me. And the question is, what does it mean, remove this cup? And the easy answer is, hey man, don't make me go through this. I don't want to do this. But it's interesting when we start reading some of the Old Testament scriptures where this idea of cup is brought out, we see a very different view. Isaiah 51:17. Awake, awake, rise up, O Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath, you who have drained it to its dregs, the goblet that makes men stagger. Jeremiah 25:15. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, said to me. Take from my hand this cup filled with the wine of my wrath, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. See, the cup that Jesus didn't want to bear wasn't the suffering of the cross. It was the separation and the wrath of God. You see, Jesus had been present when Adam and Eve made their choice. And he knew what the wrath of God was. When they were cut off from the garden, when a flaming sword was put in place and that idyllic garden that had been prepared especially for them was cut off from them forever. At least until right now. When he came to earth to reestablish that opportunity for men and women to be in the presence of God in an intimate way once again. But he knew that in order for that to happen, he was going to have to take upon himself that wrath. He was going to have to carry that separation. And through the eons of existence, he had been with the Father and faced with even one night, 2 days, 3 days of separation. He said, I can't bear it. Please don't make me bear your wrath. But in the midst of praying that prayer, he also prayed, let your will be done. So, what happens when God doesn't answer my prayers the way I want them answered? What do I do when God says no? What good does it do me to pray when I'm pretty sure that the answer He's going to give isn't the answer that I want, and it's not going to change the circumstances in front of me all that much? There's a story about a minister who noticed a young boy who was kneeling off to the side of the room after a youth group meeting. And he was praying fervently. The preacher came within earshot of the boy, and he kept hearing him say over and over, Tokyo, Tokyo, Tokyo. He didn't really understand what that meant. So after the boy finished praying, he walked over to him and he said, Son, I'm so pleased that I saw you praying so fervently, but I couldn't help overhear you say something that sounded like Tokyo, Tokyo, Tokyo. What was that all about? The boy said, well, I just finished taking my geography test in school, and I've been praying as hard as I can that God would make Tokyo the capital of France. Now, God's not going to make Tokyo the capital of France. And oftentimes, God is not going to change the circumstances in front of us. So why pray? Well, what we see in Jesus is that there is a different reason for prayer than just to change to my will and to get what I want. And what we see is that the prayer that transforms us in our times of weakness into those times of strength are prayers that are less concerned about moving God to our will as they are in moving us to God's will. You see, Jesus knew He was going to have to face that crucifixion. He knew it was in the plan. He knew that was His purpose. And even in the midst of struggling with that, He said, God, let your will be done. It was not a prayer of hopelessness. It was not a prayer of defeat. It was a prayer of surrender to the will of God. And it was in that surrender that Jesus found His courage and found His strength. So how do we then make courageous choices? Well, number one, we've got to be willing to do the right thing when others around us aren't, regardless of what the immediate reward might be. Back in 1993, there was a cross-country race in Division II track and field of the NCAAs. It was about 128 runners that ran this 6.2-mile cross-country course. And about 2/3 of the way through, one of the runners realized that everyone in front of him had missed a turn. And he started yelling and screaming and saying, you guys are going the wrong way. You've headed the wrong direction. But only 4 people were willing to actually turn, not follow the crowd, and to follow him. His name was Mike Del Calvo, and he was from a little college, Western State College in Colorado. Now, when they got to the end, only those 4 had finished the course the way that it had been designed. Only those 4 had actually run 6.2 miles. But interestingly enough, In a widely criticized decision, the officials of the race allowed the abbreviated course to stand, and Mike DeCalvo was placed 123rd out of 128 runners, and the four that followed him were 24, 25, 26, and 27. One didn't finish. You see, the world doesn't always reward us for doing the right thing. It doesn't necessarily reward us for staying on track, literally or figuratively. But the path that we choose to follow is important to God. And one day, those of us who have already trusted Christ for our salvation will appear before Him. And He will know what were the choices you made when faced with those tough decisions. No shortcuts will be recognized then, and only those who have truly run the full race are going to receive the reward. I love the way that Bill Hybels talked about this. He said, every single day we make choices that show whether we're courageous or cowardly. We choose between the right thing and the convenient thing, sticking to a conviction or caving in for the sake of comfort, greed, or approval. We choose either to take a carefully thought out risk or to crawl into a shrinking shell of safety, security, and inactivity. We choose either to believe in God and trust Him, even when we don't always understand His ways, or to second guess Him and to cower in the corners of doubt and fear. The second thing that we need to do to make courageous choices is we need to keep a long-term perspective of what consequences really are. When I was a child, I attended church at the Wesleyan Church of Christ in Wichita, Kansas, where I grew up many of my years. And there was a family there by the name of the Comstocks. The dad, Gerald Comstock, was a test pilot for Boeing. I remember they had a little girl who was about 3 years old. I was probably 9 or 10 at the time. And she's a beautiful, blonde-headed girl. Everybody was just in love with the family. Well, we moved away from Wesleyan in 1969, moved out to Southern California. And shortly after we got out there, we received word that Gerald Comstock was killed in a plane crash as doing some of his test pilot duties. He was flying low-level atmospheric tests for the Air Force near Rome, New York. And it's not so significant that he died as much as how he died. And the following is an excerpt from an editorial about that crash, which appeared in a Rome newspaper, Rome, New York. A salute to Gerald R. Comstock, test pilot killed in an aircraft crash near Lake Delta School. When something malfunctioned in his plane, Comstock apparently decided to bring his ship down in a crash landing in a field rather than parachute, and chanced the plane diving into a nearby residential and school area. He apparently had the opportunity to save his own life at the risk of others, and that he did not is the measure of the man. He went on to write, Gerald had a wife, Grace, and a small preschool daughter. There are unrecognized heroes among our ordinary neighbors. What is it that gives one man or woman the ability to see the long-term consequences of acting selfishly to save themselves now? What is it that allows them to turn from that safety and decide they're going to give that up to save other people? It's the same thing that causes firefighters to run into burning buildings, knowing what the danger is. It's the same thing that caused Jesus to stand up in the garden and walk forward to his fate, knowing what the cross left for him. It's the same thing that causes some young people to walk away from parties where there's drugs and sex and all of the things that would lure them away from their commitment to God. It's the same thing that causes some midlife professionals to put their career in second place so they can dedicate more time to serving God and His church. It's the recognition in the words of one of my favorite movies, that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. And it's the knowledge that while there are short-term and painful consequences sometimes for sacrificing your own will, your own desire, your own success, there are much longer and deeper consequences for failing to do so. The third item, what makes a choice courageous, is keeping the eternal goal in mind. 1993, Paul Azinger was one of the top golfers in the professional golf tour. He had had 7 years in a row of winning a tournament, which at that time was a record. That particular year, he had won 3 tournaments. He won one of the majors, he won the Memorial, and he won the New England Classic. He had 10 top 10 finishes that year and was second on the money list to only one other person. Probably at the very top of his life and of his game. But at the end of that year, he was diagnosed with cancer in his shoulder bone. And he realized that his greatest challenge was just beginning. In his subsequent book, which he entitled Zinger, the Paul Azinger story, he wrote about his fight with cancer. He said, "A genuine feeling of fear came over me. I could die of cancer. And then another reality hit me even harder. I'm going to die eventually anyway, whether from cancer or something else. It's just a question of when." And so everything that I'd accomplished in golf became meaningless to me. All I wanted to do was to live. And then he remembered something that a friend of his, Larry Moody, who had taught a Bible study on the tour, had said to him. "Zinger, we're not in the land of the living, going to the land of the dying. We're in the land of the dying, trying to get to the land of the living." When we keep that goal in mind, we make good choices. The last item of what makes a choice courageous is our willingness and ability to submit to the will of God. Billy Graham once wrote, "I watched the deckhands on a great liner in the United States as they docked that ship in New York Harbor. First, they threw out a rope to the men on the dock. Then inside the boat, the great motors went to work and pulled on that great cable. But oddly enough, the pier wasn't pulled out to the ship. The ship was pulled up snugly to the pier. Prayer is that rope that pulls us to God. We have to learn to say what Christ said. Not my will, but your will be done." So how do we develop courage? First of all, we have to overcome fear. How many times in the Bible does it say, "Be strong and courageous, do not fear"? Well, I can tell you there are at least 365 references in the Bible where the term "do not be afraid, do not fear" is used in some form. And a couple of them are up here. "The Lord is the light of my salvation. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you're blessed. Don't fear their threats. Don't be frightened. And so do not fear, for I am with you. Don't be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous hand." You see, at the end of the day, we have a choice. We can choose to do things our way, which might give us safety and security and comfort and convenience. It might satisfy our greed. It might give us approval of those around us, but it's very temporal. Or we can choose, what in the world? We can choose God's way. And God's way involves faith that what He's doing in our lives is the right thing, even if we don't understand it. It involves trust that there is a greater force at work than the ones inside of us. It involves conviction that when Jesus came to earth and came to save our souls, that He gave us, through His Spirit, the capacity and the capability to make courageous decisions. It involves submission to the will of God when it's easy to go a different direction. It involves obedience. It involves acceptance that I sometimes just have to give in to what God's path is for me. And it is a very eternal perspective. At the end of the day, Jesus came to earth and showed us that in His obedience to the Father, in providing salvation for us, He illustrated the power of courageous choice when we are aligned to the will of God. And may each of us find in this Easter season the inspiration to make the courageous choices that God calls us to as individuals and as a church. Let's stand.